guest of the day is Dr. Kaustubh is India's leading design thinking trainer, coach, and an innovation and strategy consultant. He is an author of best-selling book, It's Logical, Innovating Profitable Business Models. And this book has answers for all the fundamental questions every entrepreneur has. He was a serial entrepreneur since 1990, founded about 4 companies, and he's also into a couple of other ventures as well. And in 2006, he has sold his commercial interest in his first three companies, and he plunked into academics and research. Kaustubh relishes the challenge of enhancing the innovation quotient. He has a visualization unique and sustainable business model, which is his forte, and he have associated with leading companies like Mercedes-Benz, Daimler, Citibank, HP, Deloitte, Mahindra Group, Yes Bank, Accenture, Amazon, L&T, Eaton, Seat, Honeywell, etc. And he's been also awarded as entrepreneurship educator and mentor by Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, Government of India, INTL, British Council, and National Entrepreneurship Network, EDI. He's also been into the unconventional user research, which is acknowledged by the Wharton School of Business. And he's a TEDx speaker, whatnot. This one book, it's logical. This have helped a lot of entrepreneurs, including me, you put your creativity and much needed importance into it. Kaustubh, so thank you so much for bringing or writing this book called It's Logical, because it is definitely helping people across India. So we have some exciting news also at the close to the session about It's Logical as well. And also to be Dr. Kaustubh is associated with many leading organizations, including 100x VC or Niti Aayog. Say, take any premier organizations, premier institutions, premier VC boards in India, Dr. Kaustubh will be part of it. I am really blessed to attend a lot of his sessions as well at the same time. And before bringing him to the stage, we have a formal way of inviting him to the stage. And allow me to introduce Sir, namaste. Thank you for joining us. And there's a formal way of inviting guests to the stage. So you are on the virtual stage now. At the meantime, let me welcome. I'm Rahul, and I represent Startup Grind Kanyakumari chapter. And joined with me is Shiva Raghavi. She is the chapter director of Startup Grind Coimbatore as well. Shiva, you can say hi to guest Dr. Kaustubh.
Hello. Hi. Hi.
So thank you so much. Without much ado, I think I should start with the fireside chat, and of course we have a lot of enthusiastic attendees joining us to have get to clear their doubts in terms of innovation. So here we go. So once again with applause. Let me with this first. This fireside chat is all about having a cool kind of attitude, but when it comes to innovation, when it comes to development, entrepreneurship, we don't have this cool mindset most of the time. But design thinking is something which can once I fell in love with design thinking, it gave me a kind of cool mindset. Okay, Dr. Kaustubh, here is my first question to you, and so thanks for joining us. And this is my first question. Why do you love innovation ecosystem? Could you just add up some your personal journey from an young Kaustubh and then to Dr. Kaustubh, who is now a well-known figure in an entire Indian or the world startup ecosystem?
First of all, Thank you very much, Rahul, and Startup Grind Kanyakumari for having me over and giving me the opportunity to kind of talk about my views. Thanks a lot. Coming to your question, Rahul, about where it all kind of originated from. I really don't know where it all originated from, but I think my dad used to be a very critical kind of an individual, finding a lot of faults in whatever products and services that were available in the market way back in the 70s and 80s. And he would constantly keep on saying, why don't these idiots create something better? And then he would list out things of how can that product be improved and things like that. Mind you, he was a lawyer by profession, but was running his own engineering unit, manufacturing unit. So he had completely changed his kind of career path from being into the government service and then coming into business of manufacturing of small little engineering components. So I think I may have picked up that habit of kind of finding customer complaints, so to say. And later on, when I grew up, it got a fancy name called pain points. Nowadays the word pain points is used very frequently for, but basically they're kind of customer complaints about what exists, what should be there, and things like that. So I think that possibly was the mindset building in my teens or something like that.
Thank you, Dr. Kaur. That was exciting to hear. So coming back to our topic this day, we talk about demystifying innovation. In this context, we all talk about innovation push, especially when Institution Innovation Council came into practice. Students had this doubt. People always they talk about innovation quotient, and startup founders when during their pitch or during their mentorship, they used to been referred by mentors. You need to work a lot on your innovation quotient. So I think you are the apt person, maybe in the entire India, who could answer me this question. So what exactly is innovation quotient?
At an individual level, I think the innovation quotient starts off with your curiosity of observing things, keenness to learn. And once you have that innate curiosity, I think the tendency to change things around naturally comes. How strong that desire for knowing stuff is. And then when that is there, automatically you find a lot of things around you that can be changed, right? Now, thinking about change and acting on the change are two different things. So somebody who thinks about the change and also acts on making it happen, that person I would call as an innovator. And when one thing leads to the other, so to say, if you have that innate sense of curiosity to know what's around, to change things around, then naturally the next stage is about trying to find out from who the users are of that particular product or service of what is wrong. So naturally the state of what in jargon would be called as empathy, trying to understand stuff from the user's perspective, I think naturally comes. So it all starts with having that innate curiosity of knowing what's happening around, trying to know what might happen around. So I think it all leads one to the other, and it leads to the most important essential of being an innovator is the ability to put yourself in the shoes of the other person, to understand what they are feeling, what they are complaining about, which is, as I mentioned, is about empathy. And once you have that, then a lot of dots also start connecting, because you have that inner kind of urge to understand the other person's perspective. And then naturally the quest for how can I then solve that issue? How can I then solve that problem naturally comes about. And that's where you kind of start connecting the dots in terms of what is maybe the technology to overcome that problem. Who should I tie up with? Who should I network with? who should be my, back-end partners, who should be my front-end channel partners, etc. All that kind of, falls in place. So it all starts with being curious, according to me.
So innovation quotient is something like curiosity that everyone should generate. That's what I have to have. I've got a key learning here. So by the meantime, audience,
Curiosity and the will to act on it also.
yes.
And the willingness to experiment. There are a bunch of things, right? At an individual level, one can do. How much do you experiment with your hunches? Do you have the conviction to go against the tide, even if the first, second experiment fails? Knowing when not to give up is also an important characteristic of an innovator, I would say.
Great. So by the meantime, participants, attendees, if you have any queries, you have some Q&A with, we can post it in chat as well, so that I can segregate. And Shiva, it will be your task of looking at those questions. So in this context, Dr. Kaustup, you have worked with a lot of leading organizations in India and across the world. When we talk about this book called It's Logical, the first, it gives a very different perspective of innovation. So normally what people think, even I had an intuition that if it is innovation, it's only a kind of product innovation, or it has to be in a process. But this book, it's logical. It's create another perspective of innovation. You can innovate anything. It may be a business, it may be a process, even it may be a business model as well. So this business model innovation, I think these days entrepreneurs is, they don't think of this third option. You can always innovate the business model. In this context, you have worked with a lot of organizations across India and the world. So what do you see? Do you have any answers to entrepreneurs? Any these methods that they should follow in terms of innovation? I mean, in terms of strategic innovation.
Yeah. See. If I ask you, anyone, to close your eyes for maybe 30 seconds and think about some innovative stuff, I think 90% plus of the answers will be something to do with artificial intelligence, augmented reality, something to do with an iPhone or a Tesla car, or something like that. So I think we have a natural tendency to associate innovation with physical products and something to do with high technology. That's a natural tendency. I think that's how we are brought up, probably. Our education system also probably reinforces that. But then, are there things beyond that which can be innovated upon? Can companies with not very differentiable product as such, not with some great technology to boot, can they also innovate? So that is where kind of my quest began about 10, 12 years back, trying to find out whether companies with ordinary products, no great technology, have they actually beaten competition or not? Now that's what led me to this observation that companies which have kind of innovated on their business model and created win-win scenarios in their ecosystem have been able to actually push large competitors in the background purely on the basis of their business models. How to think about the business model? I have kind of 6 different questions that an entrepreneur can ask himself or herself. Question number 1 is, how do I reach my customer? Do I reach my customer through the conventional chain of marketing channel partners like wholesalers, distributors, retailers, etc.? Or is there any way that I can reach the customers in a different way using some latest platforms, some different technology, etc.? Let me give you an example. One of my students had created a very simple product somewhere back in 2014. Motor controller operated remotely through a mobile app. this motor controller was used by farmers to kind of switch their motor pumps on whenever they wanted, whenever the local water supply came, etc., etc., etc. This had been observed because water supply from the local municipality would come somewhere in the night, and the farmer would have to wake up in the night just to switch the motor on and off. So this boy had created a very simple controller with a mobile app. In 2014, this was not a new product. It was probably the 30th or the 32nd in the market. Larger companies like Jain Irrigation Limited, etc., existed in the market space since probably 2006, 2007 with this particular product. But this guy was very enthusiastic and, went ahead with it. And as all startups, we are very enthusiastic with our stuff. There's a lot of passion behind it. So his first year's projections were, I will sell 1,200 units. Second year's projection was 3,500 units. And when he actually went into the market, he realized, he got a big shock that he had to go through to sell to farmers. He had to go through that conventional, marketing channels like a wholesaler, distributor, and a retailer. And I'm not exaggerating. When he went to those guys, not even one fellow gave him an appointment. Not even one wholesaler, distributor, or retailer gave him an appointment, because this entire marketing channel was monopolized by these large companies, and they wouldn't allow any smaller company to enter in that space. So this guy in the first year sold something like 56 units, a big number of 56 units as against his projection of 1,200 units. Second year, he sold some 98 or 99 units as against a projection of 3,500 units. Now, this fellow did not give up. Somewhere in 2016, the current government passed a law in the parliament that we will reduce farmer subsidies. Mind you, they will reduce farmer subsidies. So if you remember, back then there was a big furor in the parliament about this government is anti-farmer and this and that. But the simple stand of the government was, earlier subsidies used to be given blanketly without any accountability. Now we will bring in accountability from the farmer side also, and the farmer will get subsidies according to what he or she deserves. Now, this fellow was selling that hardware, 80, 90 pieces a year, but he was in that ecosystem and constantly looking around of improving his products. When he got to know about this particular law of the government that they want to give farmers pinpointed subsidies, his natural next question was, how will the government give pinpointed subsidies unless they have some parameters to judge how the farmer is performing, right? They need some parameters of what inputs the farmer is utilizing, etc. So he quickly, in a space of about 2 or 3 months, he created a cloud platform which would collect data from his hardware about what was the electricity consumption in the field, what was the water consumption in the field. And with these 2 data points, he went to the local government saying, hey, you guys, do these parameters help you in determining the kind of subsidy to be given to the farmer? Because that determines how much inputs the farmer is utilizing, how much costs the farmer is incurring. So this was like music to the ears of the local government, that those data points. And gradually, as an effect, what happened was, in the space of the next 6-7 months, the local government started promoting his hardware as compared to the larger companies, right? So he was able to bypass that monopolistic chain of distributors, wholesalers, etc. So that was his first victory. Then with this kind of success, a little bit of success in this space, he made the best decision ever he must have made in his professional life. Is he opened that cloud platform to his competing fellows also. Competitors' hardware also could be linked to his cloud, and that data also could be picked up. So suddenly, from picking up data from only 100 pieces, which he had sold himself, data started coming from thousands of pieces sold by competitors also. That data became suddenly a big pipeline of data for the government, right? And this fellow now is more of a cloud company than a hardware manufacturing company, all right? Then later on in 2017, the government passed a law about crop insurance. Each farmer should get some crop insurance. Once again, now to allocate the amount of insurance, the government needed parameters to judge the performance of the farmer. What were those parameters? What is the soil fertility quotient in terms of, what are the nutrients the soil has? What is the pH value of the water that is used for irrigation? What is the soil moisture content, etc., etc., etc. Now, this boy did not have any sensors to manufacture all that. So he smartly collaborated with all the other sensor manufacturers who were in that space and opened his own cloud platform for those sensor guys also. And suddenly data points increased, and suddenly the value of his cloud to the government increased. And now this fellow is really doing quite well, scaling up quite well, has a regular contract with Bihar state government, has MOUs with Punjab government, Haryana government, etc. The point in talking about this example was he reached the same customer, but in a different manner. Earlier, he was trying to sell the hardware to the customer directly, but later on, he converted his product into a service and went through the government. Thereby, the government also started kind of not compulsorily pushing his hardware, but there was a soft pushing of his own hardware through the other channel. So how do we reach the customer in a different manner? That could be one building block of creating a unique business model. Mind you, the product was the same. There was no great technology used in this except for the cloud platform. That's also not a new technology. It's a 15-year-old technology. Then comes the next question, I would say, is how do we optimize our operations? How do we optimize our processes? How do we kind of reduce duplication of effort or things like that? Say, for example, I'm sure all of you would have probably heard of this application called Duolingo, this language learning app, right? We download that when we want to learn a foreign language, right? If you really analyze Duolingo's business model, it's quite smart. What they do is they are actually a translation company. Suppose, Rahul, you are, say, a Japanese company wanting to enter India. You would want some of your documents, product manuals, instruction manuals to be translated into Indian languages, right? So if I am Duolingo, I take up your job for the translation. What I do is I break down that document into small little words, sentences, and paragraphs, and create nice little animated tutorials around each of these components and push it down through the Google Play Store or the App Store, where hundreds of thousands of people Indians who want to learn Japanese language, download that and play with all those tutorials which I have sent you, which Duolingo has sent them. Play with these tutorials means what? You are actually doing small little translation of those words and sentences and paragraphs and things like that as you advance, level 1, level 2, level 3, level 7, level 10, level 12, etc. And at the back end, Duolingo has a very smart algorithm, intelligent algorithm, which picks up these translations from hundreds of thousands of all of us who are wanting to learn the Japanese language. And it stitches together the document through the best translations received from the crowd. Thereby now, I am making money from both sides. Duolingo is getting paid from the Japanese company as well as from the consumers who have downloaded that app. Of course, it's a freemium app. Certain levels are free. After that, you have to subscribe through that service. Or after a certain level, there will be in-app videos and in-app advertisements, which is another revenue stream generated by Duolingo. So what has Duolingo done here? It has eliminated the need of employing hundreds of translators of various languages by crowdsourcing all this information. That's what I call as optimization of operations. There could be a lot of other examples, but we won't have time to discuss all of that. So that's the second question. How do we optimize operations? Are there smart ways to optimize operations? Third is, how do we source our manpower? Now Duolingo sourced its manpower by crowdsourcing their translation job, right? What does Stack Overflow do? Similar this thing, right? What does Uber do? Who's its manpower? It's all freelancers, right? So they are converting their fixed cost into a completely variable cost, which keeps their operation very lean. I mean, that's the lean startup methodology, so to say. How can you keep your operations lean? By keeping your manpower sourcing also very lean. So another important question to be asked is, can you convert your fixed costs into variable costs? So that's another way of looking at it. Third is, then how do you source your inputs? Inputs are what you need to run your business. Maybe physical inputs, say like for Uber, a vehicle is an input to run its business, right? So because of their freelance manpower model, the freelancer brings in his or her own car onto the platform, which means Uber is able to source its inputs practically at no cost, right? So how do we smartly source our inputs? That's question number 4. Question number 5 is, now you have recruited manpower, whether open source or otherwise. You have recruited vendors for inputs, etc. What kinds of tie-ups should you seek with them is the next question, the 5th question. That is, should you have tight, one-sided or very tightly knit service level agreements, or should they be open? Now, because Uber sources its manpower and inputs from freelancers, they have a very open kind of an agreement with these folks who are on the Uber app, in the sense that if an Uber driver wants to log off, Uber doesn't say don't log off. The driver can log off anytime he or she wants to. In fact, the looseness goes to the extent that Uber does not even tell them that don't log on to the Ola platform. The driver is free to log off an Uber platform and go to the Ola platform whenever he or she wants to. So it's a very loose kind of an agreement, right? There could be some other tight service level agreements when you are outsourcing. So companies like, large companies which outsource from across the world, say from China, say from India, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, whatever it is. Say, let's take an example of IKEA. IKEA sources its goods from all around the world, right? And they come in those tightly packed boxes as per design, cut wooden pieces, MDF or HDF pieces with exact holes at exact points, exact tappings and drillings at exact points, a set of screws, a set of spanners, etc., come from all these vendors. Now, if there is any hanky-panky in any of these packages, the vendor will get 1 warning, 2 warnings, and the 3rd warning means the vendor is out of the circuit. So this is a very tight service level agreement, depending on the kind of business model that you are propagating. IKEA propagates this DIY kind of a do-it-yourself kind of a philosophy. So they can't tolerate any hanky-panky from vendors. So it's a very tight agreement. Whereas in the case of Uber, it's a very loose agreement. So 5th question to be answered is, what kinds of tie-ups should we seek with our ecosystem partners? And finally, the question is about, how do we create an optimal product mix? Most companies, maybe as a startup, we are a single product company. But as you grow, we become a multiple product company. Like, we have multiple products in our portfolio. So how do we maintain an optimal product mix so that the sale of one product supports the sale of another? There are no preferably there are no kind of crossroads there, at least at the startup stage. When you grow up as a large company, you might want to create different products at loggerheads with each other also. Like, for example, Hindustan Unilever has a Dove as well as a Lux as a pairs. In the market, they fight with each other, but at the back end, they're all together. But their policy is about, how do we capture maximum market share with different brands? So that's their policy. As a startup, you can't have that. You will probably start with a single product, but as you grow, you will have more products in your portfolio. So how do you maintain an optimal product mix such that you don't end up with too much inventory at the end of the year? Like, for example, since I was talking about IKEA itself, IKEA operates in 40, 45 different countries, probably 50 countries across the world. And they sell quite well in most of the countries, right? Now, IKEA is in the space of furniture, which is very taste driven. Cultural choices of colors and shapes are different across cultures, but still they manage to remain relevant in each culture. How are they able to make that happen? they have a very smart way of sourcing their designs. We would imagine that IKEA comes up with so many designs every 6 months or every month. They roll out more and more designs, which means they must be having a very strong team of designers sitting in Sweden, their headquarters. But understand that if they have a large number of designers sitting in Sweden, Swedish national folks, that will be an expensive asset. One single designer may cost probably 100,000 to 125,000 euros. Having a team of 200 to 500 such will be like a killer for them. So they have a very smart way of sourcing designs. They have a rolling contest on their website wherein designers, furniture designers from across the globe are allowed to upload their designs. IKEA keeps the right to choose which will go into their catalog. Now, which means IKEA has converted their fixed manpower into a complete freelancing manpower. So that's a smart way of outsourcing there. And because these designs come from designers across the globe, the designers are from those localities, from those cultures. Naturally, they bring in their cultural choices and preferences into their designs, which foolproofs IKEA's catalog whenever they go into those cultures, So that way they are able to very smartly keep an optimal mix, create an optimal mix of so many products that they launch across different countries, different cultures, etc. So if you can keep these 6 questions in mind, I think one can create some unique and differentiable and sustainable business models. So 6 questions. I'll just repeat. 1, how do I reach my customer? How do I optimize my operations? How do I source my manpower? How do what kinds of tie-ups do I seek with my partners, whether my manpower partners, whether my vendor partners, whether my marketing partners? 5th is how do I source my inputs? And the last one is how do we create an optimal product mix? I think these are very simple questions, but they need a lot of introspection and a lot of research from the market side. It is not necessary that you have to differentiate on all these 6 questions. Even if you're able to differentiate on 1 or 2 of these questions, I think you are in the space of creating a different, unique business model.
Great, sir. So it was a perfect, this one answer could solve most of the problems, most of the questions entrepreneurs do have. So coming back to a junkyard called design thinking, there is a lot of myth centered around design thinking, or you need to have a kind of design mindset. If you want to do design thinking, you need to learn design to do design thinking. There are a lot of myths centered around this. Even I heard people confusing the architectural design to design thinking as well. So can you just throw some insights on how design thinking can help us solve a problem, and how students, in terms of innovation or in terms of startup founders, they can do design thinking effectively to solve a problem?
Right. See, design thinking, a lot of talk has been happening around for the last 20, 25 years across the globe, and last 10 odd years in India, so to say. But what is design? It is simply a problem-solving approach, and it's an approach to problem solving. There are so many approaches to problem solving, and a lot of them overlap. But what I like about design thinking is that at the beginning of problem solving, design thinking puts a lot of emphasis on understanding the user. A lot of emphasis on understanding the user, and how to understand the user without really just asking or conducting surveys or conducting interviews with the user. How can you observe the user well? How can you kind of get under the skin of the user without really the user coming to know that he or she is being researched upon? Those are the toolkits, kind of, methodologies which come from a designer's toolkit. If you go to a design school, they teach you a lot of ethnography, immersive research, observation techniques, even interviewing techniques without making the person, the subject, intimidated. So there is a lot of emphasis on the user as a human. It's not as a customer. it's like, if I were to say simply, if you know, in B schools, business schools, most of the B schools make a mistake of teaching consumer psychology in the first semester itself. But they fail to understand that the consumer is finally a human being. So I would introduce a subject of pure core psychology first, and then take them into consumer behavior. So this is an application of design thinking into education, so to say. You understand that it's a human being whom you're dealing with. Let us understand what their motivations in life are, what their distractions in life are, what are their frustrations in life, etc., etc. Because if you treat that human being as a consumer first, without understanding the basic psychology of a human being, you're not going to be able to create great products. You're not even going to be able to create, good communication strategies with these people. So so design thinking puts a lot of emphasis on that empathy bit, which is what I like a lot, which appeals to me a lot. And naturally, if you kind of, the whole process of design thinking is an iterative and exploratory method, in the sense that you put a lot of emphasis on understanding the user, come back to your drawing board, redefine the problem. Automatically, the problem gets redefined. Many a times we start solving the problem from our own understanding, our own perspective of what the problem is. Whereas when we go in the field, we come back with a completely different perspective that the user is having about the problem. That's typically called redefining the problem, right? Once you have kind of captured the problem definition correctly, then it is about ideation for solution generation. Then once you have a concept in place, you go back to the kind of, to the same set of users or a similar target group, maybe a different set of users, but a similar target group, to get their feedback. From that feedback, you understand what needs to be changed. So your prototype gets tweaked a little bit. Again, you tweak it. Again, you go back to those users to let them use that particular product or service that you created, get some more feedback. So after 7, 8, 10 iterations, whatever number of iterations that you feel, now I'm ready for a launch, the whole product goes through those iterations. So it's iterative and exploratory in nature. And then you kind of take it to market, soft launch and all that kind of stuff, which I don't really need to talk about. But if you notice, this whole approach is keeping the user at the center at all times, right? From understanding the problem, to defining the problem, to creating a prototype, to getting feedback, iteratively correcting, acting on that feedback, and gradually refining the product. Now, because of this, when you keep the user at the center at all times, the probability of innovation will automatically go up, because you're constantly in touch with the end user's requirements. At the same time, the risk of obsolescence also goes down, because you are constantly in touch with what the evolving needs of the user are. So probability of innovation goes up, risk of obsolescence comes down. So that's what I like about design thinking. The single most differentiating factor about design thinking is its total emphasis on empathy, understanding the user and keeping the user at the center at all times. Otherwise, there are multiple ideation techniques, there are multiple prototyping techniques, a lot of things are there. But what differentiates design thinking is that emphasis on the user at all times.
Great stuff, great. So coming around this, the same kind of user research, there is something called, in empathy, it starts with the complete user research. But we talk about more into unconventional user research. So how this customers, for the innovators, can frame a right set of questions to be asked to the users. Number two is can you throw some insights into unconventional user research as well?
See, normally people kind of, equate user research with some surveys, questionnaires, interviews, etc., etc., etc. Now, if you go to a design school, they will teach you a lot of more methods of understanding users beyond interviews and, beyond surveys and things like that. there are, I have come across about 27 different methods of user research from a designer's toolkit. Uh, let me talk with some examples. Somewhere around, have you heard of this, Mumbai's favorite street food is vada pav. You must have heard of vada pav, right?
Yes.
Correct. Have you heard of this franchised out chain called Goli Vada Pav?
I mean, I have heard because through a book.
All right. So let me put it very simply. All of us have heard about McDonald's, right? It's a franchised out chain selling burgers and fast food. So Goli Vada Pav is a franchised out version, but selling this Vada Pav, okay? Mumbai's favorite street food. Now, somewhere in 2012, he wanted to relaunch in Bombay with a big bang. He had launched in 2008, and for some political reasons, he had to withdraw from Bombay, etc. I would go into all that. And then the political upheavals kind of diminished in 3 years. And in 2011-12, he wanted to come back to Mumbai. And at that time, he said that I will come back to Mumbai, not just with one single product, but with a portfolio of eatables, with a menu of eatables and beverages to be serviced at my stalls, at my kiosks. And I was in contact with him at that time, and he said that the eatables that I will have in my menu, I am quite clear about. But I'm not very clear about what kind of beverages should I serve at my kiosks along with this hot, spicy vada pav. And he mentioned, he said, will you help me finding the answer to that? So basically, it was a research project. The question being, what would people prefer after eating a hot spicy vada pav? What would they prefer to drink at these roadside kiosks? When I work in these academic institutions, I throw these kinds of projects open to students. So I sent a common email on the student group asking if anybody wants to join in. And 11 kids responded. They would like to join into this project. And initially we were thinking, now we had no idea of how to do that research back then. The initial responses were, back in 2012, etc. This tool called SurveyMonkey had just come into India. Every Tom, Dick and Harry was floating SurveyMonkey questionnaires and these Google forms on the internet to capture data. Then we said, let us ask people on the roadside, just random people will ask, what would you like to have after eating a hot spicy vada pav? But personally, I have a feeling that people don't answer very honestly when asked direct questions. So one needs to really find out through different means to understand what people want. So after a lot of brainstorming, this was the month of May or so, May 2012, we came to a unique methodology. What we did was we went to the founder of Goli Vada Pav, Venkatesh Iyer, saying that you want to relaunch in Bombay, right? So let us do a free sampling exercise coupled with user research. So we identified 3 locations across Mumbai to capture the 3 different kind of demographic sets where these kiosks were set up with his branding, Goli Vada Pav branding, nicely, all his staff with the uniform and chef hat and stuff like that, and doling out free vada pavs to anybody who would walk into the kiosk. The condition was that you will get, anybody who walks in would get a free vada pav to eat under one condition. After having eaten it, you will have to play a game with us. All right. So this kiosk was divided into 2 halves. At the front, anybody walking in would be eating that and then would be taken at the back side, which was not visible in the beginning, what was there at the back end. Then we had set up a very simple game, that ring throwing game, which we all played as kids when we visited these melas and, fairs and things like that. Multiple objects used to be kept in front of us, and we would be given a bunch of rings and would throw the rings. And if the ring fell exactly around the object, you would get to take that object home as a prize, right? We had simulated a similar exercise, but this time with beverages. 11 beverages kept in a semicircle. After having eaten that hot spicy vada pav, the subject would be brought in there and given a bunch of 10 rings. and told that you can throw a ring at any of these beverages. If your ring falls exactly around that beverage, you will get to drink it. All right. Very simple game. And my students were distributed across these three kiosks in bunches of three, 4 people. The brief to them was just observe what these people are throwing their rings at and keep on tally marks, keep a note like tally marks you learned in school. So we figured out, some people spending all their 10 rings trying to get one drink. Some people trying to throw 5 rings at one, 4 at another one at another one. So this kind of a thing method was kind of giving weightage to the preference, right? If somebody threw all 10 rings at one drink, that means that person's weight for that drink was 10x. If somebody threw 5 rings at one drink, that person's weight preference was 5x. We captured this data across about these 3 outlets for about 6 to 7 days. And we captured information from 904 such subjects, 904 footfalls. And when we put it all in an Excel sheet, we calculated the weighted average. And completely contrary to our expectation, the most preferred drink came out to be masala chai, masala tea, hot piping masala tea. And mind you, this exercise was done from 15th May to 21st May in 2012, when temperatures in May in Mumbai are between 37 to 40 to 43 degrees, scorching hot, and on the roadside. These kiosks were on the roadside. If we had done a questionnaire or a focus group discussion or something like that, I think we would have not got this answer. We would have got cold drinks as the answer, right? What do you think? Yeah. Now, so what did we do? We kind of created a simulation of the real deal, real stall. We gamified the user research in the sense that we made the user play a game, which meant that we were not asking any direct questions. We were just observing natural behavior. And when you make a person play a game, that person's competitive spirits are at the highest. So a lot of your other psychological guards are down, But when you're interviewing or when you're asking a question through a questionnaire method, people's antennae are up. They don't want to sound stupid. But when you make a person play a game, your entire focus is on winning whatever that is in front of you. So the real choices and preferences come out. So that way, there are multiple ways in which one can formulate your user research. Gamifying it is one. We did a simulation. Then this other what the students were doing, observing, is typically called as a fly on the wall technique. Fly on the wall means not interfering with the user at all, just observing from a distance what is happening. The key activity that you want to find out about your user, focus your researchers, put your researchers on the job of focusing on that activity and finding out how the user is responding in that case. So there are multiple ways in which one can go beyond interviews and focus group discussions.
So yes.
I mean, I mentioned these in the book itself, so yes. Maybe you can.
Yeah, I'm coming to that, sir, as well. Now, so what even as I was also teacher turned entrepreneur. One thing which I used to teach students when I teach engineering subjects is that this is engineering. This is how you have to do. But when I fell in love with design thinking and I started, reading books like It's Logical. One thing which what popped out into our mind or my mind or our entire mind is that, you have a different perspective looking at things.
Right.
So probably everyone can, this is that what Dr. Kaustubh has to give to us. The key takeaway from Dr. Kaustubh to all of us is that 2 things. One, when you looking at a problem, use a different perspective to look around the problem. So that is one key learning which Dr. Kaustubh has to give to all of us. So, sir, we have a time constraint, and I have asked you 1 hour of a precious schedule. I have 2 more questions. One is that when does a business need a pivot? Now that is one core concept. When does this a business need a pivot, a business idea or anything? When does it need a pivot?
See, if you keep on taking feedback from your users, you will come to know sooner that you need to pivot, right? So constantly be in touch with your consumers. Indicators like fall in market share, fall in customer adoption, fall in revenue could be indicators of you wanting to relook at your business and maybe pivot at that point. That could be one. Sometimes, some other time, also, an opportunity which comes up out of the blue. Like, for example, this that farming application which I talked about, one of my students who created the cloud, right? So he was anyway struggling with his revenue anyway, but then because he was in that ecosystem, he observed that opportunity, that regulation from the parliament, from the government, as an opportunity, and he quickly changed his entire business from being a hardware manufacturer to a cloud-based software company. So that was a grand pivot there, right? So it could be, as I mentioned, losing market share, losing revenue, customers moving away from your product to something else, or it could be some completely new trigger in the form of a new technology coming in. We need to be able to foresee in the future that with this platform, with this new technology coming in, will we be sustainable or not? Then don't wait till somebody else displaces you. So these are 3-4 things that. Another thing that people very commonly talk about is Net Promoter Score, NPS. When your NPS starts going below 0, that's the time you need to really start looking at pivoting. But that is okay. That's a very theoretical way of looking at it, yes. But there are a lot of other these other parameters that one needs to be alive to begin with.
So for this, I just want to add something, like, to answer specifically this question, I can give you one beautiful topic by Dr. Kaustubh in this, creating a new product cheat sheet. Even Dr. Sanjay Mehta of 100x VC have quoted this, and then I started eagerly to read, how to create a new product or service. That's beautifully, about this NPS, Net Promoter Score, and of course, lot of, this one, that itself is a book. Creating a new, that's a chapter in its logical book, but that itself a lifetime learning how to create a new product or service. That gave me such a, I am into no, I cannot say I'm into a product sector, I'm into a service sector, to be very open, or into a collaboration kind of platform. So even to me, I've gained a lot of insights in this creating a new product or service. So that is a one must read for all student innovators, student entrepreneurs, and also all the upcoming budding, even experienced entrepreneurs who need a pivot. That one thing can give you a lot of. So here is my final question in this fireside chat, and because of time constraint, and then we'll go for a couple of Q&A as well. Normally, this is one familiar question to all our celebrated entrepreneurs. People these days are very fond of raising funds. Only if you raise funds, you will become a celebrated entrepreneur. Or people have a notion that if I'm not raising funds, I'm going to fail and then I cannot do anything. And that's the reason why most of the student innovators these days, they're not coming forward, fearing of this lack of funds, or I cannot raise funds. So do you have any suggestion? You have a decade of experience into working with a lot of entrepreneurs, leading organizations. Even you are also part of investment firms as well. So, can someone necessarily survive without raising funds in terms of bootstrapping, etc.? Can you cover this in an outset on this?
I think in the beginning, bootstrapping is the best way to go, because you are experimenting with a lot of things. You don't want an investor to be dictating to you what you want to do. You don't want to be burdened with some responsibility of somebody else's funds. So all these examples which I talked about, from my students' experiences, have all been bootstrapped efforts. Later on, they have raised investment when they have a solid, POC or solid customer traction in the space. And investors also will not come to you unless you have some traction with what you're doing. Unless you have a good product or offering, investors also will not come to you. So many, across these B schools, I see this, obsession about getting funding. But at the same time, also understand that funding will not come unless you create something of value, right? So obsess about your customer, about your end user, create a great offering for that end user. Automatically, venture funds and angel investors will run behind you. That's one thing I would like to make very clear. And of course, what the investor looks is not just the product or service. It looks at you as an individual, because finally, the investor is investing money on you as an individual. The product may fail, but will you as an individual pivot on the product and take it forward, pivot on the business and take it forward? So there is a lot of emphasis on you as an individual. What is your integrity? What is your persistence level? How keen are you about creating giving great service to your customers? So a lot of it depends on your attitude also. I would say, I would not use the word also. I think everything depends on what attitude you display to the investor, because that person is judging you at all times. The product or service is kind of secondary to what you are as an individual. And just get rid of this fad of, if I don't get funded, I will be nowhere. Look at a lot of these companies, startups that are doing well, they bootstrapped for the first 1.5 years or so. And then when they had something in hand, then they went to these investors for scaling up, either at the technology level or to reach out to customers, promotional expenses. That's where, at scale up, you will need these kinds of fundings. At the beginning, I think you should, the best, creating a product or service doesn't take more than, according to me, a few lakhs, not even in 2 digits lakhs, less than, I would say 4 or 5 lakhs maximum. For which, do you want to give away 25% of your company to an outsider? That's a question that you need to answer. Something like 3, 4, 5 lakhs, I think we can beg, borrow. I'm not saying steal, but beg and borrow from our networks, friends, relatives, parents, etc., and make it happen to create a proof of concept. And also, if you cultivate a bunch of users who are willing to experiment with you, by telling them very openly that I am experimenting with this product, are you willing to try it out? If you are transparent with your initial set of users, they will be very happy experimenting with you. Maybe out of 100 customers that you have, maybe 30 may not be happy, but those 70 who will really are experimenting with you, they understand your spirit in making them happy, your attitude about giving them great customer service by being ready to tweak your product, etc. And that bunch of happy customers or experimental customers who have will be great viral nodes for you at your scale up time. Keep that in mind, and keep that bunch of customers who are willing to experiment with you. Don't forget them even when you become big.
So thank you so further, and we'll go for that couple of questions. So Shiva, you can moderate if any attendees has a couple of questions, you could drop it in chat box, or you can unmute yourself and you can ask to talk. There's a question from Abhishek Gupta, doctor. So what is the scope of online pharmacy in India?
Scope of online
pharmacy in India?
I think it's very good, considering the vastness of our country, considering the now the reach of e-commerce, digitization, etc. I think it's good, definitely good. Plus, government also setting up a lot of infrastructure, making electronic medical records compulsory. Naturally, all that is going to go hand in hand in that healthcare space.
So, Dr. Abhishek Gupta, I think your question is answered live. Yeah, thank you, Arjun. And also, I should also remind of partners of Startup Grind, Oracle for Startups, Centers for Startups, and American Express. They are the featured partners. And Oracle for Startups have taken granted for this event. And also, I should also say about Finnoise, Rajiv of Finnoise. You recently have attended a program at Niti Aayog. So he's also one of the partner of this today's fireside chat, and he wants to say hi to you, Doctor. He's not here, but he wants to say hi to you, and also Tamil Indian of Frigate. Frigate is in design thinking on-demand manufacturing, and Tamil Indian is a big fan of you. So he wants to give a hi, and then of course Periyar University Incubation Confederation, Periyar University is an incubation center, and Mr. Gautam used to attend all your online programs as well. So he wants to say hi to you, and of course the settlement table and Sham of Vegroot AgriTech. He's a big fan. See, all these power partners today are directly or indirectly been benefited by you or your learnings. And they want to say hi to you. And of course, Gen C of Satish and Hussain of Gen C, Neenu Ritin of the Social Town, Kavita and Namita of Learning Heroes, and of course Shiva is here, Shivaragavi is here of Startup Culture, yes, Stella Mary's College of Engineering, Dr. Suresh Pramil Kumar, he wants to, he have attended our recent program which we had it online with you, and then Startup Payanam of Naveen Anna. Startup Payanam is a big community of entrepreneurs here in Tamil Nadu, and Naveen and RG Naveen also has a hi to you because he have recently attended your program. So I want to introduce this book called It's Logical. I just will keep away my virtual background. I'm just keeping no virtual background. So this is the book. It's Logical, and I'm talking with the author of this book. It's Logical, Innovating Profitable Business Models. So whatever we have discussed today, it answers all the basic questions of all entrepreneurs, especially this part called, creating a new product cheat sheet, or actionable steps, or business model innovation, what not, hitting bullseye question. This is a favorite topic of mine, the bullseye question, and user-centered research, gamified research. Everything is been answered in this book. So what we offer today is, a couple of you who want to purchase this book, yes, it's available in Amazon. It's available in Amazon. We will send you the link, and for two people, our partners is offering free. Our partners will be paying the cost of this book. So two people can avail that who comes first on a first come first serve basis. So before the close of the program, I will be posting the link in Amazon where you can purchase this book, and this is a must read. And even a happy news which I got from Periyar University Business Incubation Confederation is they are going to purchase this book, which will be a must read for all their incubatees. So that is one best thing I have to thank you, Gautam, for giving me that privilege and introducing this book. And he wants, sir, once again, he wants you to launch that program as well later on. Yeah, Amit. Yes, Amit. Definitely, Amit. I will be sending you the link, so you can share, I'll be sending you the link. You can book, and one of our partner will pay you for that, and you are getting this book completely free for you to learn. And Shiva, you can unmute and you can talk if you have some questions to Dr. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was a great event. I was able to get so much of insights from you. Thank you so much for the wonderful event, sir. So to introduce myself, I'm also in the startup grind, and I'm actually heading Coimbatore chapter in Coimbatore. So thank you so much for joining us. And coming back to the questions. So normally when startups are starting their career, I really wanted to know what kind of mentors they can get from the troop of mentors. There will be tons of mentors out there in the community. So how to select a mentor for a startup, sir? So that would be my question.
See, I think if you talk to many mentors, you will find someone who will resonate, right? So there's no standard formula for that. But many a time, a lot of people don't talk about their concept in the fear that, oh, somebody will steal it. I think that's something that you should not be doing. You should be talking about your concept, especially to people from industry who have a lot of experience. You never know where you will get that, support from, where you will get that one small idea which will just transform the way you think. So keep talking to people and keep attending these conferences, TIE events, or startup grinds like yours and things like that. I think you will just know when you meet the right person. So there is no formula for it, I would say.
Great, sir. Thank you so much. So, can I ask one more question? Was there a dare to dream moment in your life? Like, I can't dare to dream moment, a dare to work moment, or like some moment in life that made you to reach here?
I started my business in 1990. And initial 10 years or so, we were developing a lot of technology. There was every day there used to be action about new things, new products being created. I was into machine tool design and automation. So it was, when you are creating a custom made special purpose machine, it's like giving birth to a new child. You are, from the drawing board to the execution, you're completely involved in adding features, and finally when it works, it's like a great joy. Somewhere around 2002 or so, we had scaled up to a certain decent scaled up to a decent level, at which time I felt that I am becoming more of a manager rather than a creator. So somewhere I started losing that what do you say, that mojo, internal mojo of every morning going and being a part of creating something new. And suddenly when you scale up to a certain level, you kind of become more of an administrator, more of a manager. So that's where I felt, no, this is not what I'm enjoying. And that's where actually, I mean, I'm openly accepting that I started losing interest in my own businesses. Somewhere around 2002 onwards or so. And somewhere I kept on thinking, is this really what I wanted to do? I'm not creating anything new. I'm not creating any new machines, but I'm just managing whatever has been built. So how do I now go to the next level? At which time that thought crossed my mind that let me wind this all up. I'm not enjoying what I'm doing, and let me get into something else. So that's something else. I was not very clear at that time, but I felt that if I kept on doing something what I didn't like doing at that phase, I think I will get into a rut. So I started consciously looking out for actually getting myself bought out, getting the companies bought out. And it took about 2.5 years to get the right kind of investor when I could actually get out of that company, all the three companies. And honestly, I had no clear idea of what I would do next. So 1 year I had just taken an off, 2005, 2006. That's the time when I kind of explored this, so to say, science of yoga. I found 3 places which talk about yoga at a scientific level. One is Swami Vivekananda Yoga Sanstha at Bangalore. One is Bihar School of Yoga in Bihar, Jharkhand. And the other one is close to Mumbai called Kaivalyadham. I went to various places, but found these three places which dealt with it as a science, not as a religious practice. And then I came into research, consulting, and academics also happened and all of that. So I think that plunge or whatever, which somewhere in 2002, which came in my mind that if I'm not enjoying it, why should I be pursuing it? But it took me 2.5 years to come out of that without without financial losses. In fact, later on, we got a pretty good valuation and came out with a good valuation way back in 2005. So I think that phase where I took that stand of, oh, I won't continue if I'm not enjoying. I think that kind of defined whatever I've been doing in the last, say, 17, 18 years.
Thank you, sir. I hope Shiva, I think your question has been answered. So, Dr. Kaustubh, it was such a wonderful learning with you. Yeah, Arun Kumar Gandhi just ordered the book. Great, Arun Kumar, great. And of course, as Amit, as we said, you can mail the details to rahul.in@startupgrind.com, where we will be, one of our partner will be booking the book for you, and it will deliver to you. And Arun Kumar have just ordered his book. Great, Arun Kumar. Definitely, Arun Kumar. It will be worth of all the money you pay. You pay a very small amount, but you're going to get lakhs of that kind of experience you are going to get in that book, Arun. Of course, and then Dr. Kaustubh, before we close, any final key learnings, any final words which you would like to say to the student innovators, student entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, all across the globe? Because this, Abram, you want something to ask? Yeah, Abram, you can unmute him. Yeah, Abram, go ahead.
Good morning, sir. I am Abhirami, founder of Greeniac. In Greeniac, we publish agriculture and fisheries related news in the form of comics. And then we are making a platform in which common people can post the farmers and fishers related news, stories, innovation, etc. And we will make it reach the right people. Yes, sir. So I want to know what is the impressive case study that you have did, like the one most startup case study that was so impressive, that their design thinking skill was so impressive. Just like you said about the Golu Vada Pav, that one that was did by your students, those research, anything like that, sir.
There is a story I have mentioned about some students, two of my students who created a wristband for speech and hearing impaired people. That story is quite interesting. It has all the tenets of design thinking, doing the user research with the customers, finding out the insights, then creating a product, something going wrong, then pivoting, changing the business model, and completely changing that business model to reach the same customer. So those 6 questions which I talked about for the business model, a majority of them they have addressed and have tweaked it successfully, pivoted it successfully. What they started off was completely different, and what actually succeeded was completely different. And these guys finally got bought over by Siemens in 2017. Their platform got bought over. So that's a good success story which I have mentioned in that book. Maybe you could refer to that.
Abrami, that is again a kind of a handbook, a kind of Gita or Bible or Quran, what I should say. They can again read this book. A lot of case studies, a lot of real-time case studies. The one best part of the book is like an immersive atmosphere, like an augmented reality, virtual reality. When you read the book, you're talking with someone. Even DK is talking with us. That's what we have to say. And then initially I don't understood DK is somewhere around Kaustubh. Dr. Kaustubh is the DK. Thank you, Dr. Kaustubh, for bringing that beautiful book, which has helped a lot of people like me. Once again, and any key learnings, that you, any advices that you wish to give to the founders, attendees, because Startup Grind, this video will be uploaded in Startup Grind YouTube channel. People all across the world will be listening to this talk. So what you have to say in common to all the startup founders, innovators? any key observations, learnings which you should share?
I mean, if I were to say it in 1 or 2 sentences, I would say that if ideas come to your head, experiment with it. Don't just give up without experimenting. Even if you fail, it will be a learning. If you succeed, it will be anyway good. So just try. Go out there and try it, is what I would say.
Thank you, Dr. Kaustubh. It was like a whole lot of experience, whole lot of learning, a bunch of insights, a lot of key takeaways. Even if it is worth spending, it is very difficult to spend hours with you, because it's one question. If some startup founders has to get a close learning with you in terms of potential and possibilities. We have a company called, like Dr. Kaustubh has a company like Potential and Possibilities. If any startup founders, student entrepreneurs, they want to learn about design thinking in detail, they want to approach you through Potential and Possibilities, what they should do, how they can reach you.
Sure. I mean, you can pass across my email ID to them.
Sure. If they have to learn a course in design thinking or workshop programs, etc., what they should do.
Yeah, I mean, I keep doing these open workshops also. Now, one is starting on Monday with TiE Mumbai. It's there on my LinkedIn, I think on my last post or something.
Yes.
You can register, people can register there. So that way, these open workshops keep on happening. All of you are welcome to join them. You can post that link.
Yeah, I'm going to do that. I'll be posting the recent workshop that Kaustubh sir is doing. It's for TiE Academy. So most of the people are like, a lot of learning. Even I have attended a program, and then Rajiv have attended a program, and Rajiv wants to attend another program. That's how, once you attend the program, you always want to learn again and again. That's what a kind of rich experience Dr. Kaustubh has to give you. So give me a second, where I will be posting you the TiE Academy program. I'm just
starting on Monday. So you asked me the question at the right time.
Yes.
So registration is still open, I presume.
Here we go with the link. Yes. So I'm just sharing the link where you can register, and of course you can follow Dr. Kaustubh in LinkedIn. He's very active in LinkedIn. And so I'm just putting the link to register the course. So here is a link to register for the upcoming program and of Dr. Kaustubh with TiE Academy. So it's in chat box, so you can register. The program starts on Monday. That's going to be worth learning, a lifetime of learning. Of course, there is, thank you, Dr. Kaustubh, for being with us, and talking with us and giving us a lot of insights. A pleasure meeting you. It's like a moment, like for me personally, it's like a dream come true. One book which changed your life, and then you're talking with the author, right life. That's something great. Thank you, Dr. Kaustubh, for being with us.
Thank you very much. All the best to everybody. See you.